Hello everyone, it's Lindsay, and recently I've been doing a lot of testing with watercolors in the new Illustrating Bible. I've had some conversations with some of you and I've heard from some of you about how the paper in this Bible behaves a little bit differently than other journaling Bibles. And so I've been testing out some different things, and today for the Tip Tuesday, we're going to talk about watercolor ground. So if you have gotten your hands on this Bible and have kind of played with it, you may notice that the paper is very good quality. It's very smooth, it's very thick, but there's something different about this paper with how it reacts with things like watercolor, and it's almost like the fibers of the paper kind of grab a hold of or absorb more of the pigment than some of my other journaling Bibles. Now, it is thicker, so I don't have as much bleed through, but I have found that watercolors do behave a little bit differently, and so I thought I'd give some different things a try and see what I could figure out. So what I have back here in my tester pages is this little grid that I created. And right now I'm taking some Kuretake Gansai Tombi watercolors. These are really great quality watercolors. And I'm just applying some pigment to a blank square. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see it on camera. Some of this is kind of hard to catch on camera and is more comes just from your playing with the paints and things. But you can almost see the fibers of the paper when it gets wet. You can see that it's grabbing a hold of the pigment, so it's kind of hard to move the color around. It almost kind of stains the surface of the paper right away. So you can move it a little bit on the surface, but you can see here where I have some harsh lines where it's really just kind of, I don't know, just sunk into the paper, but it's not bleeding through at this point. It's just more absorbent, I think. So it's just a different type of paper than what is in our standard journaling Bibles or even just a regular Bible. So the paper does still have that smooth feeling to it, but it doesn't resist color, I don't think, as much as a regular journaling Bible. And so it's just a little bit different to work on with paints. So here in the top left-hand corner, I have some Art Basics clear gesso. Now, if you've watched me for a while, you know I hate watercoloring on gesso. Some of you love it, and that's your go-to. Watercolors don't typically bleed through in my journaling Bibles, so I like to just work on a blank, naked page. But what you can see here on the gesso is that paint, because the gesso creates a barrier, the paint and water is just sitting on top of that barrier, and so it pools and moves. And so yes, you can blend things and move the color, but it's very unpredictable because it's just freely sitting on top of the gesso. So I don't like that. I feel like it's hard to build up color intensity. Same thing here, I'm testing the Liquitex matte gel medium in the bottom left-hand corner. This is like it's smoother than gesso. Even the best clear gesso matte gel medium is smoother than that. And this creates even more of a barrier with no texture, and so the paint and water really sits on top of that matte gel medium. You can see it's kind of pooling to itself. The pigment is pooling to the center, pulling away from the edges, and you can kind of see where you get that. It's just kind of sitting funny. I don't know. I don't like working on gesso or matte gel medium with watercolor. Now, what I'm showing you there is some Daniel Smith watercolor ground, and this is something I've been wanting to try for a while. And I did go ahead and apply one layer of this to the square and dry it. And you can see here that it's meant to replicate cold press watercolor or watercolor paper. And so it is a little bit more absorbent than, let's say, gesso or matte gel medium, but it does create enough of a barrier between the paper and the paint that it moves a little bit better and blends a little bit better than just on a blank naked page. So you can see there's not as much pooling. There is still some pooling, but you get some pooling on watercolor paper also, but it isn't drawing away from the edges quite as much as it does on the gesso and the matte gel medium. Now, I can show you this video and I can show it to you over and over, but you're not really going to understand this fully unless you experience it for yourself, I think, and kind of get a feel for how the paint behaves differently on these different mediums. But you can see there that the watercolor ground kind of stays a consistent color throughout the swatch. Now, what I did is I dried these swatches and I'm going back in with just clean water to see how much of the paint that I can lift. If you've watercolored on watercolor paper, you can typically, depending on the paint, but typically you can pull up quite a bit of the pigment by reactivating it with water. However, on these blank Bible pages, you cannot move that paint hardly at all. It is really set into the fibers of that paper. On clear gesso, you can see I can pick up quite a bit of the pigment because the gesso and the matte gel medium have created a barrier between the paint and the paper. So the paint is not able to absorb into the fibers of the paper. So you can see with that matte gel medium, you can almost 100% lift the color. Now with watercolor ground over here, you can see it's created a barrier between the paint and the paper. It's absorbent enough to grab a hold of the pigment, but I can still lift quite a bit of the pigment, almost as much as I can on the matte gel medium. So you can see there, again, I'm going to go back in and try to lift it from the blank paper, and you really can't. And at this point, I can tell that the fibers of the paper are starting to deteriorate and starting to break down. You can kind of see there's like a speckled texture to it. So you don't want to scrub at these pages too much or layer, things and try to blend things too harshly on this paper. It will break down. So I'm going to dry this and let you look at the back and see what the back looks like. Again, those 3 products are creating a barrier between the paint and the paper, so I shouldn't see any bleed through. Typically, I don't see bleed through with watercolors on regular journaling Bible paper. So I did pick a red because reds, if any color are going to bleed through, it's going to be red. And you can see I actually am getting some bleed through on the blank page where I really got it wet and really scrubbed and started to break down that paper. Some of the pigment is kind of wanting to come through the page. I think it's a little bit more noticeable because those other 3 swatches have, don't even hardly have any shadowing. And so that watercolor that you're seeing kind of peek through would be pretty easy to cover, but it is wanting to start to come through the page as that page kind of broke down. Now I did want to see how easily it is to erase the pencil, because if you've drawn over gesso, it can be pretty hard to erase pencil. And on a blank page, no problem, I can erase pencil. Matte gel medium, all 3 of these, matte gel medium, clear gesso, and watercolor ground, I did have some difficulty erasing 100%. So just keep that in mind if you are going to prep your page with one of these. You probably aren't going to want to do a whole lot of drawing with a pencil and then erasing your pencil marks, because it just is not going to erase 100%. Now the watercolor ground, as far as texture goes, it is very similar to the grittiness of Liquitex clear gesso. So those of you who have used Liquitex clear gesso and hate the grittiness, you're probably not going to like the watercolor ground. I wouldn't say that it's as gritty and rough, but it definitely has a texture to it. A texture like you would feel on cold pressed watercolor paper. So cold pressed watercolor paper on the side that isn't smooth, the bumpy side, does have a texture, and that is the texture that this watercolor ground has. I'm going to lift this up so you can see, how that pencil isn't 100% able to move. So if I'm going to be using watercolor in this Bible, I am probably going to reach for watercolor ground. I like how the watercolors behave a little bit better on that watercolor ground than it does on blank pages or matte gel medium or gesso, and it does kind of reinforce the page, so I can go hog wild with water and paint and things like that and not worry about breaking down the paper. So I'm going to sped this up quite a bit, but I've gone over to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 29, and I'm just going to paint. So what I've done is I've actually prepped this page with 2 layers of watercolor ground. Now, the directions on the watercolor ground say to apply however you want, whether it's with a brush. I used a foam brush so I would get as smooth of an application as possible. And it does say to let it cure for about 24 hours at least, and not to use a heat tool to speed up the drying process. So that may deter some of you that you kind of have to pre-plan. I will admit that I'm a rebel, and I did use a heat tool to dry it in between the 2 layers, and then I dried that last layer with my heat tool. It just so happened with my filming schedule that I did leave this on my desk overnight and then come back to it to paint. But I think for what we're doing, I don't know that it would really cause that big of a problem to heat set this like you would gesso application. I don't know that it's 100% necessary to let it cure for 24 hours. I don't know. You do you test it out, let me know what you think. But on those swatches in the back of the Bible, those were just heat set. I didn't let that cure, and so I didn't really have a problem with it not working, I don't think. So I mean, I don't know. In my Bible, I'm going to be using my heat tool because I just don't have the patience to let it sit there for 24 hours and cure. So that may be a downside for the watercolor ground if you want to follow the directions, is that it does need to cure. But you can see here, I am still having some pooling of color. Now, I will say, I think part of that is the water brush that I'm using. This particular water brush, the water really free flows quite a bit. So these paints are being very, very wet when I'm putting them down. But you can see that it is still kind of grabbing a hold of the pigment. So I can get really intense color payoff. It's not wanting to completely pull away from the edges like it did on the gesso. I'm going in with very loose impressionistic flowers, so it's okay if it's a little bit extra wet and messy. And like I said, I applied 2 layers just to make sure that it was fully covered and good to go. I would like to try this some more with maybe a different brush that doesn't have it as quite as wet. You'll see when I do my lettering how that comes out when you have less water. I think it behaves a lot better. But I think if you're struggling with watercolor in this new Bible, try the watercolor ground. It does add some texture to the page, which I know is going to be kind of a turnoff for some people. But if you are really into watercolor, I think that you will like how the watercolors behave better over the watercolor ground than just a naked page or gesso. Now, if you have Liquitex clear gesso, that would probably be a pretty similar like a dupe for watercolor ground, and that's what I used in the past when I would watercolor and wanted page prep. I would use Liquitex clear gesso because it did have that grittiness that would kind of grab a hold of the pigment a little bit better. I did kind of rub over this page with a paper towel to see if I could break down some of the grittiness, and I wasn't able to make it get any smoother. So there is texture, but you can see the page is pretty flat. I did not close it and leave it, closed overnight. This was covered in that watercolor ground and then just let to dry, and it did stay pretty flat. So that's kind of nice about these pages, is that they don't wrinkle quite as much, I don't think, once they've kind of sat and relaxed, and they don't shrink. The pages don't shrink as much as some of the other journaling Bibles that I've played in. So you can see I just really loosely laid down some flowers. I dried that first layer, and now I can go back in and add some more details. I'm trying to use less water, more pigment to get, some darker areas and some more detail. I'm kind of struggling with this water brush, so I need to try something else in the future. But I sped this up, or this video would be very, very long. It's more about watercolor ground than the technique for these flowers. These flowers come with practice. Practice, practice, practice. I bought myself a pad of watercolor paper from Walmart, and I just go to town loosely painting all kinds of different flowers, looking up references on Pinterest, and trying to recreate them, and just practice. Here for my title, I'm going to spell out "He is my strength," and this will be a free download over on my blog if you want to check that out. I have 2 different fonts there. The top one is more of a font that you could get with using a paintbrush, which I'm going to do. The bottom font is more of something that you could create with a pen and kind of create that faux calligraphy. So whichever you feel like you have more control with or better with, I gave you 2 different options. I'll also put the names of the fonts that I used over on my blog. I always get questions about that, so those will be over there. But you can see here, I'm starting out with that same water brush, loading it up with quite a bit of pigment, and it's hard to see on camera, but I can see those big bold letters through the page since they are really thick and black. I didn't have too much of a problem. But I am noticing that this water brush is just flowing way too much with the water. So at one point here, I think right after the M, I am going to go ahead and dump the water out of this brush and just work with it with the water that's in the paint, and that worked way better. You'll see the E and he right now looks fine, but by the time I get done, there was so much liquid, it's kind of obliterated the empty space in the center of the E. And so I would suggest using a better quality water brush or less water when you are working on the watercolor ground, because it is enough of a barrier that the paint and water does kind of want to pool a little bit. And so this verse here again is Isaiah chapter 40 verse 29. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. So I put here, he is my strength. And you can see I'm getting much more control with the paint now that I've emptied the water from the brush. And again, you can use that bottom version of the title with a precision pen or the Tombow Feud calligraphy pen, whatever your favorite pen is, and do that faux calligraphy if you want. Went ahead and dried that. Now I'm going to just add some ink splatters. And then I've left myself a little spot there to add some journaling. Now, one thing I did notice was that, this page had cured for 24 hours. It has been heat set multiple times. And I tried to go in with my 0.25 precision pen from Illustrated Faith. Now, I'm using a T ruler to draw my lines, and this worked out fine. The pen wrote just fine. If you get one of these T rulers, I had my husband hack off the tip of it so that it would fit in this Bible. And you can see I'm getting no problem writing over it with the pen for the lines. But when I went in to go to do my journaling, it was really struggling to write over that watercolor ground. So I did switch over to the Tombow Feud pen, which is a little bit thicker tipped pen and a felt tip, and that worked a little bit better writing over the watercolor ground. For this part, I've gone back to the Illustrated Faith 0.25 precision pen, and I am just very sketchily adding some impressionistic style like lines around these flowers, and it is kind of skipping and kind of acting kind of funny on that watercolor ground. So just keep that in mind. This may be pretty harsh on your pens, so you may want to test out your pens and figure out what works best on this watercolor ground. Like I said, that Tombow Feud pen worked pretty well. This is working fine. I want it to be kind of skippy and patchy, so it's working, but if you want really precise, nice lines, you may want to steer away from the smaller tipped pens. So I'm just going in and adding those pen details, and that's pretty much it. I know that's a lot of information in this video. Rewatch it if you need to catch those details. I will have all the products linked down below for you guys. Check out the blog post for that free printable and some more information about watercolor ground. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave those down below for me, and I'll pop back in and answer those. Give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful. Subscribe to my channel if you're not already subscribed, and until next time, thank you so much. Bye-bye.